Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. Today I'm going to talk about double hits, what they are and how we deal with them. Now, a double hit is roughly a simultaneous hit where both parties hit one another. That can also be within what we call one tempo, which is one sort of strike in time, if you like. So one person hits the other lashes back and hits them back. So that would also be considered double hits in most sort of scenarios. So where both people are getting hit. Now, some sports and martial arts deal with this in different sort of ways. One of the common ways is just to discount it. That's in many ways the simplest and easiest way to get around a double hit. So you're having a fight, two people come together, they hit each other, you just say, cancel that double hit, step back, go back at it. Now, from a judging perspective, that's easy, and you get a nice clear result at the end. Unfortunately, the big problem with that, of course, is that both people have been hit, and that is crap if that's a real fight. Obviously, when we're practicing this as a martial art, you want to win and not get hurt. That is the, really what we're aiming for. So another method would be looking at things like right away in sport fencing, or looking at on a box. You could have a timing system where you time it as to which person hit first within, say, a hundredth of a second or something like that. Again, it's really not too helpful to us because, again, both people are getting hurt. And the reasons why both people get hit actually don't matter. You can have a system in place that might try and emulate a scenario where people do the sensible thing, but in a real fight, people don't always do the sensible thing, or what you might expect. So you might expect that if you cut someone's leg, they would actually defend it because they don't want to get hit. Now, in theory, that's what they should do. But what they might actually do in real life is a different story altogether. And sort of, personal accounts of combat as well as coroner's reports are full of accounts of people not doing what you might expect. So just because, say, somebody swipes for your leg, doesn't mean you are justified in just smacking them in the head and taking the cut to the leg. That's really no good at all. That cut to the leg could be potentially as bad as your cut to their head. So that's a sort of a brief introduction as to what we would consider a double hit. And then, how do we deal with it? Because obviously we don't want to encourage it. In fact, very much the opposite. We want to try and get as few double hits into the fight as possible. Now, don't think that every sparring match that you do has to have no double hits, because sparring isn't always 100% competitive. It's not always about treating it like a real fight. Sometimes it needs to be. But sparring is also a perfect opportunity to really experiment and try out the things that you've learned, because the chances are you're trying out a new move. It probably won't work the first time, the second, or maybe even the third. So when you're watching a sparring match, just because there are double hits taking place, that doesn't mean that those parties would necessarily have done those things if you now said to them, this is for real, or this is to 3 points and you win £100 at the end of it, or something like that. So not every sparring match has to be competitive, but you should still be having them competitive often enough. So that's the first thing, is don't be worried about there being double hits. You just need to get to a point where when you say it's now a competitive fight, you try and rule them out as much as humanly possible. Part of that is down to the individual practitioner. Now, what we're doing here as a martial art, it is a martial art, but ultimately we are doing it for sportive purposes, because no longer do we carry swords in the street for self-defense. We don't challenge each other to duels with swords. So even though we want to, as much as possible, emulate what they were doing and the reasons they were doing it in these sort of medieval and Renaissance martial arts schools, we aren't doing that for the same reason anymore. So you have to individually, not just as an instructor, but as a student, constantly think about this fight as, what would it be like if it was real? Again, not all the time, but often enough. So part of ruling out double hits is the responsibility of each and every individual student of HEMA. So you can't sort of place the blame on anyone as to why too many double hits are taking place. Certainly instructors should be leading the way on discouraging them. So what are some methods for discouraging double hits? Well, usually this will come down to some scenario where it's some kind of competition of some kind, where you've actually got a judge. Now, one of the common ways that you've got now is the afterblow. And the system being, overall, just loosely, is that when you place a hit, your opponent has a single tempo to hit you back, and that will discount the whole exchange, and then you go back at it. And that's to simulate you landing a hit and safely recovering. In theory, it's really good. Unfortunately, it does bring up a number of other problems. One of the biggest is that it encourages very much a sort of an aggressive approach as to not defending yourself, because if you know you can discount your opponent's hit, then you automatically go for the hit. You don't try and defend yourself. Even sort of subconsciously, chances are you'll see it all the time. I've seen it so often in competition, is that people will automatically think, no matter what, hit the opponent. So if there's an open, you hit them. If they've hit you, you hit them. There's not an emphasis on defence. So that's one problem. So the afterblow system, in theory, is good, and I think it definitely has a place at times. But if you use it all the time, you're going to have some real issues. It will change the fight too much from what you really want it to be. Another system is weighting points for different target zones. So a common one would be 2 points for the head and chest, and 1 point for the arms and the legs. Unfortunately, you see, again, it's going to evolve into a scenario where somebody snipes to the leg and the other smacks them in the head because they know they're going to be a point up from the whole scenario. Or they could, for example, put the lead arm up and take the hit on the lead arm and strike with their weapon, and again, they've gone 2 points for a chest, and the opponent's got 1 point on the arm. So weighting the targets like that, I don't find works particularly well either. Then on to a few other things that I have seen work quite well. One is if you have 3 double hits in a fight, that both parties are either out completely from the competition or go down and do 20 press-ups, which is, it seems like an odd way of going about things, and it kind of is, but it does work rather well. We've done this at a number of tournaments in the club in the past, and it really does discourage people from those double hits. If you say that both people are out, so both out of the competition on, say, 3 double hits, in theory that's a good thing, but it's not very satisfying from an audience perspective or student perspective. It'd be far better to try and find a way to get around it. And also, if you're working in kind of pools for competitions as well, again, it can be really, really complex. And if you have the afterblow rule in place and you're calling the afterblows double hits, again, you're going to have an awful lot of people just cancel out from the tournament. So there are some issues there. So what do we do? Well, we don't have that many competitions. Competitions are a small part for us, really. In HEMA, some people, competition is the sort of big thing to aim for. For us, it's quite a small part of what we do. And I think it's a valuable part of what we do, but still only a small part of the actual practice of HEMA. So what do we do? Well, going back to the individual, you have to actually take it seriously yourself and not treat it like it is a stick fight, and do actually treat it like it is a sword fight. And there are lots of things you can do about this. One interesting thing I've seen is that our fencing masks, they actually provide an immense amount of protection, which is of course a good thing, but it also means that people sometimes lead with their head in ways that they really wouldn't if their head was actually in danger. Interesting sort of test of this you can actually put into practice is the Spez sort of foam training swords. We've got the sabers for those, and they look horrible, but actually they're kind of an interesting training weapon in that, no, they don't react to one another particularly realistically, but you can spar with them with no protective gear at all. Now, I'd recommend you actually only do this as an advanced practitioner, because there are still some risks to teeth and to eyes and things like that, so you've got to be a bit sensible. But those things hit pretty hard if you take a full power, sort of full moulinet rotation cut to the top of the head. Trust me, you really will feel that. It will shock you, and you'll sort of start to actually protect that head. And that's an interesting example of where I think training without some protective gear can be really advantageous, in a way that training without the protective gear with, say, a synthetic or a steel isn't, because there isn't that threat of taking a full power cut to the head, because nobody can ever actually deliver it. So that's an interesting one. Going back again, I think the most important thing of all is, on an individual basis, you keep thinking that this is actually a sharp fight, that this is actually real, and don't take the chances when you shouldn't. Again, if you're trying to practice new techniques, fine, do that. But if you're trying to say this is actually a competitive, real fight, if this was, with sharps, then don't take silly chances. Don't do things that are going to get you hit, and work on protection over everything else. Now, a lot of sword styles encourage a style of fight that is aggressive in its defense, and by that I mean, if you look to say saber, it's very much parry riposte, where we make solid, what we would call dead parries. Whereas if you look to say something like sort of German longsword or Italian rapier combat, it's very much that sort of single time defense action, what we'd call contratempo in rapier, and that means that rather than making a parry and countering, we're actually in one action, engaging, defending and striking all in one. Now those techniques are some of the hardest to actually learn and use properly in the fight. So again, you're going to have to practice them an awful lot, and don't worry about getting double hits whilst you're learning to use them. Use that as a progression to learn how to get them working well, and eventually you will rule out the double hits as much as possible. Other things to consider are using dead parries where you have to. Just because, say, German longsword doesn't particularly like dead parries, you don't not use them when they are necessary. Sometimes you just need to actually defend yourself, and that's it. And there's no actual advantage to what you've done, but you've stopped the opponent's attack. So don't think you can't stop and do a dead parry. You can. Another one would be actually look after your target zones. Again, the legs are a really common one. It's so often people will just accept a cut to the leg if they can deliver a cut to the head or the neck. That's not acceptable. First priority is don't get hit, then try and hit them back. So you'll see in my videos I do a lot of shifts of my lead leg. That's very, very common in Roeth's saber system, but you'll see it a lot in so many forms of swordsmanship, and as a result I very rarely get hit in that leg. So it's not just about when somebody's cut into the leg, in fact, with Roeth. It is if you're actually doing a lot of parries, particularly with the sword quite high, you remove that leg, you shift that body weight, so that if they divert their attack or they've used a feint or they're going to double up or something like that, it's already protected. So don't think sort of, you shift it just when it's necessary. Often you'll see me shifting that withdrawal of the leg, as is recommended in Roeth, when I'm doing all kinds of stuff which actually involves blade work up nice and high. Another really important aspect of this is looking at what sort of hits would be incapacitating and which wouldn't. And of course you cannot always guarantee which one they would be, but to some degree you can estimate. So with a thrust work, for example, thrust work causes mass internal damage on a regular basis, but it really incapacitates an opponent quickly. So you will actually get frequent instances historically of that sort of, Excalibur style spears gone through and running up it and hacking somebody's head off. And there is a reason that boar spears and boar swords have, big prongs on them to actually stop that boar getting up and biting your head. Consider that. Thrust work, really incapacitating. So if you're going to land a good thrust, get the hell out of there quickly. So there's good reason to use kind of afterblow stuff with that. But when it comes down to cutting, we would say there are some cuts which will immediately stop a fight, and largely that comes down to a really powerful cut to the head, the neck, or the lead hand and arm up to the shoulder. Sometimes we'd also consider the leg, for a cut, powerful cut to the lead leg, but overall it really is, the important one is the head, neck and the lead arm. So if that is hit, immediate stop. And there are some actions that you would do in a fight, some sort of cuts that you would go for, which would leave you open, but in the knowledge that you have ended your opponent and they wouldn't actually be able to hit you back. So if you're using blunt weapons in a sparring scenario, you land that sort of heavy cut and they might sort of, nick you on the chest afterwards. But you've done it in the knowledge that had that been a sharp weapon, you would have stopped them there and then, and they wouldn't have been able to hit you back. And that is a prime example of where the afterblow doesn't work particularly well. So in conclusion, there is no perfect solution to try and get rid of double hits, but I recommend that you experiment and regularly try different methods to try and encourage you to basically look after yourself in the fight and protect yourself as much as possible. Try these different methods of the afterblows, the punishment stuff with press-ups and elimination type stuff in tournaments. and things like the foam swords without protective gear, and basically just experiment with different methods to make sure that you get as much sort of variety as you possibly can. And ultimately, it always comes down to you as an individual. Are you treating it like a real fight? And not every single sparring bout that you do, but enough of them that it actually is giving you some kind of realistic interpretation of the fight as much as can possibly be done. So that'll be all for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.